Welcome everyone to the fourth talk now in our series on writing transcultural histories in the ancient Mediterranean. Um, we are very happy and honored to today be hearing from Professor Irad Malkin, someone who needs very, very little introduction, I'm sure. Um, but just for the sake of it, uh, he's done fascinating work on Mediterranean history, from Greek colonization to various sort of work on religion and belonging, things like foundation myths. Really, it's quite difficult to sum it up this quickly. I think his work on ethnicity and collective identity might be quite topical to what we'll be hearing today. Um, I think I should probably stop trying to summarize the work of someone who articulates it so excellently and hand it over to you, Irad, whenever you're ready.
Well, thank you so much for having me for this invitation. I think the issue you're raising is of enormous significance because, on the one hand, we live in a connected world, but we also like to stress differences, particularities, and localities. In fact, the general trend of this talk stems from my very original question that I keep coming back to from various angles, namely the connection between human beings and places. How do we articulate such connections? Why do we do that? Do we need to justify our presence? The Book of Psalms likens man to a tree whose roots reach the waters of the river. But roots are always a metaphor because human beings have always moved around on this earth. And it is that various modalities of movement, whether in myth and story, in colonization, in archaeology, and so on, that has followed sort of a trajectory of my various studies. And since I do know classical Hebrew and I've had a little training, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I do wish to make some comparisons and ask about the implication of those comparisons as we shall go along. And the first passage, just for the sake of illustration, is that very strange story in Genesis chapter 6, where we find the Bnei Elohim, the sons of God. Suddenly he has sons. There's no mother, by the way, mentioned. The sons of God go down to earth and saw, I'm quoting, the daughters of men, that they were fair, and they took them as wives as they chose along. And so the story goes on, and God isn't too happy about all this. The trouble is not so much that they're consorting with human women, is the question of immortality. Because what distinguishes, and that's a Greek question as well, between man and God, as it were, is not the question of wisdom and knowledge, but it's a question of immortality. There are two trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And of course, having eaten from the tree of knowledge, the danger is that man and woman, in this case, will eat from the tree of life, and I quote, "They will be just like us," says God to apparently his sons. And so basically, that's the only difference. It's not a question of wisdom and depth and so on, but because human life is limited, therefore, we cannot reach the divine knowledge as well. So, and this is the point of the story, because the Lord God stops human life at 120 years. But what is interesting is the final verse that talks about the time it happened. It was the time of the gibborim and the Nephilim. Gibborim are like heroes, men of old, the various translations make them. Nephilim are supposed to be some kind of giants. Now, the whole story has been noted by others, of course, in the comparisons with Hesiod's catalog of women. And the question for biblical scholars is often who influenced who, and when did that influence happen? Was the biblical text had this insertion of a Greek myth, or perhaps this a Near Eastern myth that made its way into the Bible and then to Greece? I'm not trying to point out trajectories. I don't believe in the validity anyway. So, but the point is the question of comparison, the question of influence. How did this happen? Now, what is influence? When we talk about the East influencing Greece, or vice versa sometimes, uh, well, literally, of course, it means flowing into, as if, and I always objected to the notion as if one culture is, with its full cups, is pouring itself into the empty cups of another. And therefore, in the book before last, the Small Greek World, I always stress the network aspects and reciprocal and the back ripple effects of movements and contexts and connections. And I think this is the same case in here. Walter Burkert and Martin West are very happy with the idea that the East influenced Greece. Margalit Finkelberg, my colleague, has also published a marvelous article on inoloukothea between East and West, where she shows that the opposite direction, in this case, is quite credible, namely a Greek myth making its way into the Near East. But what is influence? What does it even mean? Is it an interesting question? For example, if you look at the history of Greek art and you look at archaic kouroi, those marvelous statues, usually of young men, they look very Egyptian. And in fact, apparently they are very influenced by Egyptian statues. Now, is this cultural appropriation? Well, there is one major difference with the kouroi, namely they are freestanding statues. Freestanding, that's a revolution in the concept of sculpture. It's the same statues, as it were, but with one difference that makes all the difference. So it doesn't matter here whether influence or not, because I hear a lot also among college students, kind of a facile charge, hey, that's cultural appropriation. Hey, in San Francisco, in the bookstore City Lights, there's a whole section called Stolen Wisdoms, which is following Martin Bernal, and I see David Tandy smiling. The point is there's no such thing as cultural appropriation. Culture is appropriation. That is the very definition of culture. Culture cannot exist without being made of composite elements. So let's forget also the value judgment implied in the charge of cultural appropriation or stolen wisdom. It's nonsense. It's basically every culture is made of elements that are appropriate in one way or another. That's the very definition of culture. On the other hand, perhaps we don't need to seek influence at all. Perhaps under similar circumstances, facing similar challenges, we'll get similar responses, even mental responses in that case. And I think the situations and the stories the Greeks and Hebrews told about migrations, settlements, conquest, colonization, the divine agency that gives you the charter myth or the right to do that, quite similar among both Hebrews and some Greeks at least. Is that because they copied each other's ideas? They appropriated each other's justifications? I doubt it. There's a good point to make about the rise of similar responses to similar situations. And let's look at that, because across the ancient Mediterranean, not just Greeks, but also often we know this through the Greeks, Phoenicians and Etruscans also told stories of immigration, settlements, conquest, displacement, and so on and so forth. But think about it for a moment. If we want to justify where we are, isn't the claim to autochthony a much stronger one? If you're already going to invent a myth of origins, why not invent a myth that says, I've always been here? Therefore, imminently, I have the right to be here. But weirdly enough, it's very rare. Among the Greeks, the Arcadians are known to be as old as the moon. Perhaps Athenians were quarreling about the notion of autochthony. Not everyone agreed. So hardly there. But you think most people would have a story of migration and arrival, but that is not the case. What I find fascinating is that the entire ancient Near East, Mesopotamia, Egypt, as far as we know about the Hittites, nothing this happens. There are no stories of migration, no stories of great mass movements of people, no great leader, no charter myth to the city of Eridu was there since the creation of the world. Now, you don't look for a human founder and a sort of Aeneas type of myth for the story. So, by contrast, both Greek and Hebrews, whether they asked each other or not, saw themselves as young nations. They had not been there when the world was created, unlike others who have. So, this sense of youthfulness. Let me quote Moshe Weinfeld about this peculiarity of the Old Testament. He says, I quote, "As is well known, most of the genres of biblical literature have their counterparts in the ancient Near East. Creation stories, genealogies, legal codes, cultic constructions, temple building accounts, royal annals, prophecies, psalms, wisdom literature of various kinds, all are widely attested in the cognate literatures from Mesopotamia, the Hittite, and the Egyptians. But the only genre lacking such counterparts is that of stories about the beginning of the nation and its settlement, which are so boldly represented in the patriarchal narratives and the accounts of the Exodus and the conquest of the land." One exception in terms of cults, this is something yet to follow, but Gunnar Eckroth has shown, or is about to show, that very detailed cultic prescriptions for sacrifice and cutting up animals in Deuteronomy and other biblical books have nothing to do with the ancient Near East. They're far more similar to Aegean practices. Wow, I think that's a huge implication. I haven't seen this followed up yet, but let us wait. It's not my idea. So, Greeks mostly saw themselves as new arrivals, foreigners in the land they were occupying. The Athenians, some of them at least, certainly in the 5th century, claimed they were autochthonous, and Herodotus makes fun of that. He says, you want to be autochthonous? That means you're not even Greek, you're Pelasgians, because you're so old and you're not even Athenians. I think I can imagine him standing in front of an Athenian audience, tongue-in-cheek, and saying it. On the other hand, we have, for example, Plato in the Theaetetus says, I quote, "We Athenians are pure Hellenists who have not mixed with barbarians, for we are like descendants of Pelops or Cadmos, Aegyptos or Danaos. We are not like them, that is, nor any others who, being barbarian by nature, Thysei, and Hellenists by convention, Nomos, dwell among us. We reside here as genuine Hellenists, not as half-barbarians." Okay, this is, of course, rhetorical tropes, but on the other hand, if you look at archaic concepts that we find, Cadmos was the founder of Thebes. He was supposedly Phoenician. Pelops, the eponymous hero of the Peloponnesos, was a Phrygian. Danaos came from Egypt. Why? Why? I think the answer lies in the title of an article by Arjun Appadurai, which is entitled "The Past as a Scarce Resource." The past as a scarce resource. Your past doesn't count for much unless you plug it into somebody else's account, which is valid and well-known. That is, I argued in The Returns of Odysseus, that is why the Romans plugged into the Greek story of the Trojan cycle, choosing to be Trojan instead of Greeks. This way they are not the same, but yet the validation of the entire story, they have their own autochthonous hero with Romulus, etc., but the Trojan story was something to connect to. And I think Greeks love the idea of being connected to much higher and vulnerable civilizations like the Egyptians and the Phoenicians and so on. On the other hand, they could easily invent Medea as the ancestress of the Medes, Perseus, that of the Persians, and Odysseus, a co-founder of the city of Rome and the leader of the migration of the Etruscans. The point I'd like to stress is that Greek migrations, as well as Hebrew migrations, were perceived as a rupture with the primordial past. We see in Thucydides' Archaeologia, for example, how the Oitoi and the Heracleidai, Dorians are entering Greece 60 years and 80 years after the Trojan War, but they are not the founders of Thebes. They are not the founders of Sparta. They've been there already. So it is at this point of dissonance with the past that the origins of the new collective identity in relation to the place that also partly defines it can begin. Now, I keep talking about place. What is a place? I recently read a book by Kressler on this. Well, there are no places in the world. Those who think they exist are wrong. Nature doesn't have places. A place is a meeting. A place is an ontological experience. A place is the encounter with human, marking out, demarcating, choosing some site to make it different. When in the Old Testament, Moses walks in the desert, there's this bush that keeps burning and keeps burning all the time. And then there's a voice comes out and says, take your shoes off. This place is sacred. This place is sacred. He didn't even know it was a place. And so this epiphany tells him that. There are a few examples of this. And so to make a place, to imbue it with meaning, to tell stories about it, to connect it to your national collective history and so on, a place is a happening. And in the English language I'm speaking now, the expression to take place means to happen, doesn't it? Avoir lieu in French, avere luogo in Italian. Why is taking a place means happening? Do you know that in Judaism, one of the names of God is makom, place? And the Talmud says, why? Because he is the place of the world, but the world is not his place. This is a Talmudic saying, which actually I quite like. Rabbi Huna says this. So, when we're talking about articulation of attitudes and of belonging, why this land is mine, and so on, we find three categories that some modern scholars, sadly, I think, confuse between them because with a tendency to see everything as political and so on. Not everything a priori is that. We can observe, for example, genealogies of the land. Sparta, for example, we have the whole list. Eurotas, the hero, his daughter Sparte, she marries Lacedaemon, the son of the eponymous nymph Teigete, and quoting Pausanias here, once in power, he first of all renamed the country and the people Lacedaemonians after himself, and then founded a city and named it after his wife. The city is called Sparta until today. However, it's precisely the rupture with this line that would be at the heart of the Dorian Sparta foundation. The hero of the land is sharply contrasted with the invading guys. So, genealogies of the land, as well as civilizing culture heroes, think, for example, of Heracles meeting Antiochus in Libya, vanquishing him, and then making Libya free for human habitation. This is not the political story of the foundation of Cyrene. This is a culture hero's story, opens up the entire land for human settlement and prosperity. So sometimes you explain the emergence of places like the island of Rhodos, emerging from the sea as a compensation to Helios because he missed out on the divine drawing lots that distributed provinces to the gods. There's another layer here. These are, especially like in Sparta, for example, the epic heroes who had been here before us, like Menelaus, king of Sparta, right? Agamemnon, Mycenae, and so on and so forth. So far, nothing is political as such. It doesn't contain any justification why specifically me should be here. That is the third category. And here we are coming to the political ktises, the foundation story, the political ones which are connected with the very establishment of the community, the community that still today sees that as its own past. I'm not talking about communities of the past that have disappeared. I'm talking about political communities that do exist, say, in the 5th century BC. So the Spartans certainly, and I've discussed this a lot in my Myth and Territory in the Spartan Mediterranean, came out last year in the second edition, because the point is that on the one hand, there's pride in rupture, pride in being nouveau venu, pride in having Zeus given this country to the Heracleidai as a gift, as Tirtaios already says. And on the other hand, there's some sort of uneasiness because of that rupture. And that uneasiness is very often conveyed in the idea of return. The Dorians are certainly newcomers. They had nothing to do with the Peloponnesos before, but the Heracleidai did, because at one point Heracles put Tyndareus back on the throne on condition that one day his descendants, Heracleidai, should come and have a right to reclaim it. Precisely it's the same argument that used by Dorieus around 510 BCE when he went to found the Heraclea, the one in Sicily. The same notion of being Heracleidai. By analogy, if you look at the books of Joshua, for example, they keep mentioning a return to Canaan, not that the Hebrew people existed at the time, but its ancestors did. Namely, Abraham, who had bought land in Canaan, Jacob, who had planted a tree in Canaan. In short, there's a notion of return. But on the whole, in general, there's far more emphasis on what we did when we came, on the story of an Exodus type of story, or the Ionian type of migration story. Namely, that is far more important. Now, in various studies of ethnicity, it's very popular to say that the identity of an ethnic group is created at the edges, namely by contrast to another. They are, which is called an us identity, how they see us and how we see them. And that makes the difference, which of course is very contested. I published on that, but I think it's important to note that the sense of agency in the we identity. Think of Mimnermus of Colophon, for example, okay? He is proud to have gotten Colophon with hybris, in the sense of violence. There's no justification here. There's no need to tell a story. There's no, this land is my land because God gave it to me. We took it. We is the we identity. It's a collective we that is also apparent in Tirtaios, and especially using the earliest poets here. Because that is what's important to notice here. It's not identity, collective identity created by contrast. It's collective identity created by a notion of common exodus, a common migration, a common settlements. So it's not dependent on contrast. The Spartan case is special, perhaps also in some other Dorian cities like Corinth, with the Bactriads, because the sense of being Heracleidai keeps justifying the position of the Spartan kings all the time. I mean, that's a continuous thing, not just a notion of primordial past. And in a sense, we're talking about founders, in this case, in connection with ancestry and ancestors. A community can see itself as new in relation to a new place simply by immigrating there. In contrast to human movement, blood has no beginning. And so the question, where do you start the first? With historical Greek colonization, the answer was easy. It was Doikistes, who had a burial in the Agora and a cult after his death. And so we knew who was the first, okay? And Greeks were interested in questions of who was the first, like Protoseuretes and others. So Plato found the notion of ancestor ridiculous. In the Theaetetus, he says, I quote, 174e, if somebody wants to check. Every single man has countless hosts of ancestors near and remote, amongst whom are to be found in every instance rich men and beggars, kings and slaves, Greeks and barbarians by the thousand. When men pride themselves on a pedigree of 25 ancestors and trace their descent back to Heracles, the son of Amphitryon, they seem to be taking curious interest in trifles. As for the 25th ancestor of Amphitryon, what he may have been is merely a matter of luck, and similarly with the 50th before him. In short, there's no such thing as an ancestor. It's always a continuous line. But you do need a starting point. So in the biblical story, we have the story of Avram, who comes from across the river, from Ur Kasdim, to the land of Canaan, because he's ordered by God to do so. And then his name is changed. Instead of Avraham, it becomes Avraham, Abraham. The moment his name is changed, he is the first. Otherwise, he's just part of a line. And this is the moment of beginning. By analogy, in the Heraclides, Ephoros says, although Eurysthenes and Proclus were both the oikistai, or the founders of the Spartan state and the two royal houses, neither was recognized as archegetes. And again, the descendants are not named after them, because you need a starting point. Heraclides are all over the place, in Argos, in Corinth. Why these? So, now another point of comparison is the question of distancing. There was Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac in the land, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the land of Canaan, and then they moved to Egypt. It takes 400 years until the exodus from Egypt to the land of Canaan. Structurally, it is parallel to the 3 generations the Heraclidae had to wait before invading the Peloponnesos and reclaiming their legacy. There's this interesting notion between the act that supposedly creates the right to the land, say Heracles' charter, and the implementation of that. And of course, the whole thing is a myth, but why do you need that distancing effect? Which I think is quite curious, and it's repetitive. Okay. The question on top of that is, what made it possible in the case of Greeks mostly to worship local heroes that had preceded them? When Apollonius, for example, describes the arrival of the Argonauts at the mouth of the river Phasis, the Argonauts pour libations to the epichorioi theoi, the local gods. There must be local gods, because the gods are everywhere. They don't know who they are, but they respect the heroes of the land, as they do when they sacrifice to the 7 anonymous heroes before the Battle of Plataea and so on. There's a sense that Echen Tengen, the gods or heroes, obtain the land, hold the land. They need to be recognized, and so on. When the 5th century too, when the Athenians founded Amphipolis, Hagnon had to bring the bones of Ressos, the Thracian hero who was an ally of Priam in the Trojan War, to appease the land. You don't want. The hero is Alexikakos. He can prevent troubles from arriving. Now, in a polytheistic, or polyheroic in this case, system, this is much easier. This is much easier because Ressos was the son of Strymon, the local river, and there's no problem with recognizing the fact that there is such a hero in the place, regardless whether he was an ally of Priam or not. I've written about it once. I was happy to see Jonathan All picked it up. It's like if you pick up this phrase of désossure, distinguishing between langue et parole, that's the key to understanding polytheistic systems, because, and I'm sorry if I'm saying something well-known and trivial here. Um, just reading Herodotus, you see how he gives you all the Greek names for the Egyptian gods, except for one passage when he said, wait a minute, in Egyptian they're called this, which means he does know the names. But there's no problem in talking about an Egyptian Athena. Because with the saussure, the idea is, to put it in a very simplified way, the idea of a dog is not the name of the dog in the language, right? There's an idea of a dog in German, you call him Hund. The idea of a dog in French, you call him chien, and so on and so forth. But it's always a dog. So the dog is lang, and chien, Hund, kelev, and so on is parole. All right? So Melkart is the parole of the idea of Heracles. And Heracles is the parole of the idea of, well, whatever name you want to give it. So, and that makes, and again, I'm not being very original here, but I think that's that what enabled collective identity to be defined not in terms of contrast with the local gods and the local heroes or gods in general, but to accept them. That is where the Hebrew traditions differ drastically. And so far we've seen similarities. But no epichoreoi theoi for the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That wouldn't work. Both conquering people divided the new land by lottery. We'll see that in a minute. And both the land had been promised by a god. Zeus to the Heracleidai, God to Abraham. Zeus gave this country, or polis, to the Heracleidai, with whom we came from windy Erineus, Cerstitaios. This is a we identity. But whereas the Spartans bridged the gap by establishing the Menelaion, called to Menelaus and Helena, and told stories about the nymph Teigete, the ancient Hebrews would have none of that. In the Bible, there are no land myths. You don't hear stories about the local cities, how they were created. There are no water springs associated with the Danaids and the Argolis. None of that. It's quite alien. You don't hear local myths. You don't hear local stories, no local ktises, which you do. Local cities have no history. In fact, the book of Joshua was supposed to recount the various conquests of the Israelite. All my archaeology colleagues claim it's a book of wishful thinking, because basically all the sites that he mentions were not destroyed or conquered, whereas the hinterland, the poor hills, which is now called Judea, that's where these nomads settled. I mean, away from the cities, away from anyone who was too strong. So basically, the book of Joshua is a negative story of the reality of, and you can actually check. I don't know, maybe it's too oversimplified, but we should know that. Now, this marked difference is made explicit time and again. I'm skipping some quotes because I want to leave time for discussion. But let me give you one from Joshua 24, and this is God speaking now. And I gave you a land which you did not labor. I gave you cities which you did not build, and you live there. I gave you vineyards and oliveyards which you planted not, yet you do eat the fruit. Now, therefore, listen to the therefore here, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve you the Lord. It's all dependent on abandoning one religion and moving to another. Abandoning the gods from beyond the river, okay, this is Mesopotamia, and worship me. And the fact that there's a continuous, it's contingent, namely, you live in cities that you never built or founded, you enjoy the fruit of vineyards that you never planted. It's okay, as long as you're with me. This is May not sound like moral justification acceptable today, but that's the point here. It's repeated time and again. Deuteronomy chapter 6, for example. And it shall be when the Lord thy God shall bring thee into the land which he swore to thy fathers. Nishba le'avotechem. Shvuah is a very strong word in Hebrew in terms of oath. To Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, to give you great and goodly cities, which you did not build, again, and houses full of good things, which you did not fill, and cisterns hewn out, which you did not hew, vineyards and olive trees, which you did not plant, and so on and so forth and so forth. Very strong emphasis on you have no connection to this land. You are foreigners upon this land. And that very foreignness is the point. All founders are foreigners because almost by definition they come from elsewhere. And the over there beyond the river is linked to the other gods. The over there is where Abraham grew up. Now it's over here, and you should not worship Elohim Acherim, other deities, other gods. And there's a choice to be made between the God that led the people to the new land and gave its charter to those people, and the local gods. And there's an option for that. And this is Joshua, he is speaking. Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve you the Lord. And if it seems evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, namely the Canaanite gods, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So, like three options here. The deities and the gods of Abraham's time from Mesopotamia, the local Amorite gods, or me. But being me depends also on the charter, because none of the other gods have given the Israelites a charter. But not bound by such monotheistic claims, the gift of the gods, in the case of Sparta explicitly, in other cases it's debated whether Delphic oracles implied the gift or not. Sometimes the word to give does appear, but aside from that, similarities. For example, if you look at the land allotment, I've just published a very long chapter in the Drawing Lots from Egalitarian to Democracy, my recent book with Eugene Bloch, and it's all about the theory, the principles, the texts that deal with land allocation and the archaeology of it, especially in the world of Greek colonies. And the world of Greek colonies, just to remind ourselves, constitutes between 30 and 40% of the entire Greek world in the Archaic period. So it's a major chunk of Greek history. Greeks, in a sense, Hebrews too, to some lesser degree perhaps, they treat the land as eremos chora. Eremos chora. It's empty. It's desert land. It's free. It doesn't matter if anybody's there. It's empty. It's free for applying a grid of equal plots of land, as we see in Greek colonies, and you divide up the land by drawing lots. And the Hebrew nachala is comparable to the Greek kleros, although the Greek kleros also implies the notion of drawing lots in and of itself, and the Hebrew nachala does not. But it's all about that. You divide the land to the settlers by lottery. In the Greek world, of course, published a whole book on that. I won't repeat that, but you'd remember that Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon divided the entire cosmos by lot, obviously not asking another god what to do, so it's a sort of egalitarian thing. Lycurgus, supposedly the legendary founder of Sparta, divided up equal plots. The equality is always important here. And archaeology, especially in Sicily, last few years, more confirmation for Megarai Blaya and so forth. So the land is divided by lot, and it's also inalienable. You cannot cut it up. You cannot sell it. And this is true for the first lots, the protoi kleroi in Greek colonies. Usually not too big, but you couldn't cut them up and you couldn't sell them. And the same thing is in the biblical injunction about the nachala. And the land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and settlers with me. There's an interesting quote from the Old Testament. The land is not the people's land. It belongs, they're like tenants upon the land, okay? It doesn't say that, but it does say that. And you see the story of the spies that Joshua, I skipped that now, that Joshua sends into the land in order to describe it. It's not just to describe it, as the English translation cannot really find a good word for describe and map it out, okay? And Joshua casts lots for them in Shiloh. Shiloh is the oracle, before the Lord. And there Joshua divided the land unto the children of Israel according to their division. ויפל להם יהושע גורל בשילה לפני יהוה. It's at Shiloh in front of the English translation always put in the word Lord, whether it says Elohim or Yehovah, different terminology, but we won't leave that now. And another point of similarity in this specific context is the use of the mantis, of the seer. And we know about the Yamidai who followed Archias and others to Syracuse. You know about Onomastos, the Delphian, who followed Batos to Cyrene. And in the biblical case, we have Elazar, the priest. I'm quoting, these are the nachalot, the inheritances, go the translation, which Elazar, the priest, and Joshua, the son of Nun, and the heads of the fathers' houses of the tribes of the children of Israel distributed for inheritance by lot in Shiloh before the God at the door of the tent of meeting. So they made an end of dividing the land. I wish you could see this. In Hebrew, it's 1.5 lines. In English, it's 7. Because Hebrew is a very, very concise language. And we should know that the word inheritance in Hebrew, Yerusha, Lareshet, has another meaning of conquest. Lareshet et haaretz means to conquer the land. Doesn't mean that you inherit it for someone. So it has both these things. And Shiloh, they're asking actually a similar question. Similar to what? Similar to the type of question Greeks would ask at the Delphic oracle. When Greeks went to colonize, the question usually was not, shall I go to Syracuse, with an answer yes or no, with an answer which could be given by a lot oracle as well. No, the question was open-ended. To which land should I go? And this formula is quoted. To which land should I go? Which means it's an open-ended question, which means it relies on the fact that Apollo has a panoptic vision of the world. Apollo knows geography. Do you think you know Libya, he says at one point in Herodotus, mocking the Therians? No, you don't. I do. Because human beings have only hydrological vision of the world. They know the roots. But Apollo has the vision from above, and therefore he can give a portion, as it were. It's a kind of a charter. So that's why I'm wondering often whether, unlike Tirtaios and the very explicit words of the gift by Zeus to the Heracleidae, does the fact that go to Croton mean that Croton is yours because I'm giving it to you, or just go to Croton? But it's something which is, it's also varied among various foundation oracles. So among close to 1,000 city-states in the Greek world, only Sparta has a charter myth of this kind, of a divine gift of the land. Only Sparta. among the close to 400 Greek colonies in the Greek world, only Taras, a colony of Sparta, has an oracle that says you should be a plague to the Yapigians, which is like the biblical injunction you should kill off all the Amalekites, perpetual war. Why? Why is that the case? When do we need a charter? And it is often, I claim that there is a direct proportion between the degree of explicitness of the charter myth. Zeus dedoketende polin. Zeus gave, I'm talking Hebrew. Zeus gave this land to us. So there's a direct proportion between how explicit the charter myth is and the degree to which you're insecure about its implementation. Once you're secure, Memnenos doesn't need the charter myth. He goes and conquers Colophon with hubris. He's proud of it. However, Sparta in the Peloponnesos, sitting on top of a population that didn't necessarily like it being there. Challenge and response. In that case, the response, the mythical articulation of a connection to the land becomes as explicit in direct relation to the charter. There are a few other aspects I could go into. I shall skip that for now. One of the interesting ones, but I published articles about this, is the status of women in such context that gets enhanced, not because they especially think women's status is not what it should be, but because of the question of the kouroi, of the kleros. For example, in the Old Testament, the daughters of the families of Joseph, you should know Joseph was not a tribe. Unlike Reuben, Judah, Simon, they were all tribes. Menashe, Ephraim, Joseph was, the last son. He never had a tribe. So his daughters say, hey, what about us? We're only women here, no men, so no land. And there's a correction, injunction that changes the laws of inheritance that say women can also inherit. But I'm putting it aside from now because I think it's a fascinating question. And just to try to sum up, we're into it for 46 minutes now, so I think it's time to do that. Whether stories such as the sons of gods and the daughters of men, that certainly have parallels in Hesiod, do stories about, which was the major part of the talk, migration, conquest, foundation, and providing an explanation or justification or just validation of why am I here? What are we doing in this land? Were we always here? If not, who brought us here? And at whose expense? All these questions need answers, and obviously got answers. Otherwise, there's no point to talk about questions that don't have answers or were never raised. But obviously they were. And obviously they were in similar contexts of challenge and response that we see in stories about Spartan migration foundation, that we see, not just Spartan, by the way, the Heraclida, by the way, divided up the Peloponnesos also by drawing lots. It's not just in Sparta. And so you see frameworks, and all of them belong to people who at large saw themselves as young, and subsections, like the Dorians, saw themselves as particularly late arrivals, 80 years after the Trojan War. And then you get the charter myths. You got one for Sparta, but you don't get that for other Dorian cities in the Aegean. You do get that in a Spartan colony founded very early in 706 BC in southern Italy. So all in all, the question of influence will always remain open. Somebody told me it's like asking the origins of a joke. I mean, everybody tells the joke, but who was the first one? Of course, there are comedians who write jokes. I'm not talking about those. But basically, these are stories and themes that move around, and like the Egyptian statues that became Greek kouroi, were questions of transformations, not necessarily of copying. And I think this is where it becomes far more sophisticated and interesting. Just instead of showing this move from point A to point B, it's the origins here, therefore what? What do I understand by that? So the picture is very complex. Transcultural movements and adaptations are obviously evident, but can also rise independently, facing similar challenges by people who saw themselves as never having been here when the world was created. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions, and so I won't immediately ask one. Um, People are free to sort of unmute themselves and ask questions, or if you want to put it in the chat, I'm happy to read it out for you. Yeah, looks like there is a question already. Let me see.
If it's written
Okay.
down, it's even better. I can.
Yeah, it is written down now.
Mm.
Do you just want to answer the question, or should I read it out?
Can I see it?
Yeah, it's just in the chat.
Uh-huh. That means I need to find that chat.
It's at the
Okay.
bottom.
Yeah, I'm looking for that.
Yeah.
Meeting, AI, share, chat. There we go. I'll read the question aloud, okay? So everybody can hear it.
Yep.
Fascinating discussion of complex topics. One question, rare, unusual vocabulary in Genesis 6. Isn't Ben Elohim a term used for angels and not necessarily literal sons of God in the terms of endangered offspring? The word Elohim in Psalms 8:5 is quoted, interpreted in Hebrew as angelos, I suppose angelos in Greek, and so on and so forth. Okay, a big question. I don't see any angels in the book of Genesis. That's a Christian interpretation. The one place where the word malach, and malach does mean angelos, is very explicit, is a meeting between Jacob and God himself on the bridge over the Yabok River. And the reason people think it's an angel, it's because at the very beginning there's some announcer, malach, and then the entire episode, in spite of the beautiful painting by Gustave Doré, which has always influenced the way the West sees this story as a struggle between Jacob and an angel, there's no angel there. There's God himself. And the point is made very explicit in this story, because he says, from now on, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Yisrael, or Israel, which literally means the one who doesn't accept and struggles with God. That's the meaning of the word Israel, the one who fights God. Not the one who obeys God, the one who fights God. That's the literal meaning. And everybody thought it's an angel. So, I'm not a biblical scholar, and I doubt very much that angels do exist, but you do have Bnei Elohim, which it's always easier to run to a metaphor, except here they're actually his sons. There's a different mythology here. Anyway, that's the way I see it.
I might ask a question while people think of their own. Just sort of thinking about the polytheism point. I find that interesting, well, I mean, I'm sure it's not surprising that I find that interesting. The way that Greeks would have used the flexibility of their, polytheistic framework to interact and form this new place. Um, I know that the study of Greek colonies and their culture is it's difficult in some ways, and so I don't know how easy this question is to answer. But is there a difference that you can see in the development of the culture of a new Greek foundation when they have a Greek hero, a mortal hero, or a historical mythological hero that forms the basis of their colony, or, you know, allows them to found the colony, versus cases where you have divine sanction? Um, is there sort of, yeah, I mean, are there differences that come about based on who they choose as the representative?
Mm. Yeah, if you're looking at it more detail, of course, there are very big differences in the way the stories are told, because the Hebrew story is far more similar to, say, the Ionian migration type of story than to the specific ktisis of, say, the foundation of Syracuse by Corinth. Okay. Um, Both the Greek mass migration story, namely, there's no mother city left behind. That's the meaning of a mass migration. In contrast to Greek colonization, which are apoikia, supposedly there's always a metropolis behind, even though the two terms, metropolis is a later term. But the function of metropolis was there. So in that sense, it's far more fragmented, and you have many more individual stories. The Old Testament does not take care to tell you the foundation of this city and that city and the other city. These are foundations of entire territories. So in that sense, it's very different. It's also different in the sense that of the avoidance of having a cult to a founder, a cult to the leader, which is very, very prominent in Greek culture. The whole point about the story of Moses is that at the end he's allowed to go up and Har Nebo, the mountain of Nebo, which faces the land of Canaan. He's allowed to see it, and then he dies. He's not allowed to cross the river Jordan and enter the land. And his place of burial is unknown. Okay, so the whole point is to avoid a cult to a founder. The These are some of the differences, and I think it's a speculation a bit to say this, but I think it's again has to do with the type of cult and ritual demanded from Israelites. Ostensibly so. Of course, the Bible itself is full of evidence to the contrary, that they're worshiping Phoenician gods and Astarte and these sons of God, what are they doing here? A colleague of mine, Guy Darshan, who was a student of Weinfeld in Jerusalem at the time, he thinks, but he doesn't develop the idea, which is a pity because it's an important historical claim. He thinks that following the collapse of the civilizations after 1177, let's say, and the emergence in the early Iron Age of independent communities around the Mediterranean, these type of stories and the sense of us being young developed then as a kind of a reaction to the collapse of the great centralized empires. It's a bit imaginary of the Hittites and so on. Perhaps, but this may confuse, this may give a reason to a phenomenon which, first of all, we have to define it as a phenomenon. I haven't checked what happens in other civilizations about the stories of migration. And for historians, I think it's a fantastic question to make a comparative research about origin stories of various peoples in the world, how to make a place. It's not the same everywhere, and then come again to the answers of influence and challenge and response.
Thank you. We have somewhere in the chat, I will read out first the question by Roxanne. Uh, this is a much later example, but in the case of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the imagery seems to me to heavily draw upon the communal memory of archaic Judah, uh, imagery of the first temple, use of Paleo-Hebrew, etc., which I think signals autochthony. When does the story shift from migrations to what seems to be one of autochthony? Is it just a result of being under the rule of another power and thus a different challenge and response? Thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
Wow. I don't know really the answer to that, I have to say. I wasn't so aware that it shifted to autochthony. The thing with autochthony, the only thing I'll say is by the time of the Bar Kokhba rebellion against Rome, a lot of time has passed. Very often when people talk about historical rights, they claim autochthony, but basically all they claim is we've been here sufficient time so that it should be considered as if we are autochthonous. And that is always, by the way, the argument with people who deny the concept of historical rights of whatever nation we're talking about. Because basically, if you deny that, then the other side can always say, all right, I'll hold on to this piece of land by force longer than you ever been here, therefore I'm getting the historical rights just by being here. So the point about the time of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, as far as I know, this is really not my period, is a lot of mythologizing of what Judah was, and let's make Judea great again, and this kind of rhetoric that was common at the time. But other than that, I can't tell you more. Sorry.
We have another comment and question from Gabriel, which, again, it's in the chat. I'll read it out as well. Thank you for this wonderful and stimulating talk. You drew a fairly strong contrast between the Greek and Hebrew attitudes towards the previous inhabitants. I would like to push back on that, not only because I suspect that there is more connection and more similarity between human things everywhere, but also because the Greeks really did erase the Pelasgian religion, perhaps even more effectively than the Hebrews. After all, the Hebrews spoke the same language as the other Canaanites, and as you pointed out, they never actually expelled the previous inhabitants. So I wonder what you think about the following proposal. Cultures emphasize the war against previous culture precisely in those cases where it does not happen. When it does happen, they don't need to bother.
Wow, I like that. This is a very nice articulation of the question here at the end. Well, you are a plague to the Epigians, and you are supposed to exterminate the Amalekites. Again, exceptions perhaps, but and you do subjugate the Givonim, I think, who are now. It's presented as a great mercy by Lord because they're not being massacred; they're simply turned into slaves. So they're not always very nice, the local people. And with the Greeks, we know that too. And in later periods, if you're allowed to mention Bar Kokhba, I'll mention Taras in the Roman times. The Tarentines were known to capture Samnite sheep, strip them of the wool, and cover their own sheep with that wool. So, and again, that's not very nice to the natives. On the other hand, not to be facetious, for example, with the case of the Pelasgians, I don't know about Pelasgians. I mean, they may have been an invention of the Greeks. People rely on various linguistic elements like the NTHOS endings and thos, korinthos, etc. They're not supposed to be Greek. Did they erase something or not? Or perhaps what we see in Greek culture is Pelasgian culture and under different names? I have no idea. I don't think we can speculate too much on that. But your point at the end is very suggestive to think of. I don't think the Ottomans bothered much about with their invasions of the Anatolian Peninsula, subcontinent, uh, with keeping the local, unless you come to modern Turkey, and suddenly they found roots in Troy and in European ancestry. But other than that, never. So I don't think it's necessarily uh, it has to do. I don't think you can really generalize here in that sense. But I think your last point is worth following up. I encourage you to do that because I'm not sure I can do that now. But it's what you're saying is basically when you keep on living with the local, and of course the Old Testament is full of cults to Phoenician gods and to local gods, and there was in the temple in Jerusalem there were statues of goddesses as well, nicely denied, of course, by the very strict monotheistic representation of that. In fact, the Bible is full of warnings by the prophets against actual practices that everybody is sacrificing to all kinds of gods in Canaan. The very warning are evidence for their existence. So, in that sense, I think you're right. There's no hostility to the local population. I did I should mention that I did write another article once concerning the notion of hinterlands. And here again, the Old Testament can be a very good source for that because when we look at the Greeks, we usually see their point of view. They're coming with a ship, landing on a headland or an offshore island, and then whatever they do, they penetrate into the hinterland, usually not very much. But what do the hinterland people think? Sometimes we can see their actions archaeologically, as we see in southern France, but we don't know what they think. On the other hand, the book of Judges in the Old Testament has the story of Samson, Shimshon, and Delilah and the Philistines. And here we have the reverse situation of an Aegean entity, Philistines, landing on the coast, staying in the coastal areas, and you get the hinterland perspective of what's going on. And again, I don't think it can tell us much about actual history, but it can certainly show what happens when you draw analogies between similar situations. Because why do the Hebrews of the hinterland go to the Philistine city, to Gaza, especially, to get iron, to get sex, and to make commerce? This is basically the three reasons why Samson goes to the Philistine cities. So, in that sense, these comparisons are worthwhile. But again, the limitation is not to be tempted and to make that into actual history. But sometimes, if your question is not about actual history, if your question about mental patterns, comparisons, challenges, and responses, then yes, it certainly is valid and worthwhile.
Um, just sort of on the point about perspectives,
About
the point of perspectives, the fact that we're getting, the Greek side of the account of a new foundation, where the migration or the arrival is centered. Do you have any sort of any thoughts or any evidence related to how maybe cases of Greeks arriving in a place where there's another new arrival or another new foundation, and how either the Greek evidence interacts with the presence of another new foundation, or, I think it would be quite remarkable if we did have evidence from the other new foundation as well. Unfortunately, this seems to be a bit of an issue. And the space from which I'm asking this question is sort of, the case of Greeks arriving in Egypt in the Saite period, and the extent to which they interact with the presence of other foreigners like the Carians or the Phoenicians. It's something that takes a bit of disentangling, I guess. Yeah.
So let me answer very briefly on two cases. One is the one you mentioned. We have to add and remember the fact that Egypt was full of mercenaries. And very often the dynamics of creating a mercenary camp, and others who claim that following the mercenaries you get a city founded, different dynamics, and also the names. You have Jewish mercenaries, you have Carian mercenaries, you have Phoenician mercenaries, you have Greek mercenaries in Egypt in the Archaic period, and all of them are clearly seen. The Jewish one stays as a Jewish cult to Yahoo for until the 4th century, until the pogroms against them after the Persian Empire is out. So I think that's more, or on the contrary, you have the Emporion at Naucratis, which again, it's a different modality of contact, and especially when there's strong local power overseeing everything. On the other hand, I've studied this again in my book, The World of the Returns of Odysseus. You ask what happens when Greeks are new arrivals and others are too. And here you have a case in the Bay of Campania with both Etruscans and Greeks arriving by sea. The Etruscans were not native to this area. And in a sense, it can be pointed out that I try to argue very early, because what happens is not that Greeks adopt Etruscan myths, or if they did, we have no idea they're Etruscan myths, but we certainly do know that Etruscans adopted Greek ones. The form of the name of Odysseus in its Euboean form is copied by the Etruscans, Utusde, with the dentals, not the Ulixes Corinthian type of naming of Odysseus, who has 27 different versions of his name in ancient Greek. But that is, and since the Euboeans, for example, are no longer playing a major part after about 700, which shows you how early that's and it does correspond archaeologically with the presence of Greeks in Cumae already in the 760s and 50s BC. So this is another context where two groups arrive in the same place. In a sense, one accepts the myths of the other, but not as a Greek myth, but as the story of a Tuesday. He's a hero tout court. He's not a Greek hero. And that's another point for this kind of polytheistic matrix in the Mediterranean that allows for such exchanges without a sense of threat or exclusiveness that you do find in monotheism, sad to say. So yes, I think that's even a more intricate example of a situation that I've termed a middle ground situation, where people adopt each other's stories, very often with a different implication or different meaning for the purpose of which the stories were told in the first place, in its original context, or adopting institutions and so on. So very often historians were asking, what did the Greeks have to offer to the Italians, say? Wine? Olives? You have everything there. No, myths. They had Homer to sell. And first you start smiling, and then you think, wait a minute, it's not such a bad idea, because in fact, this kind of framework has taken over Italy. In the sense of Odysseus becoming the founder of Cortona, and Hellanikos bringing Odysseus with Aeneas to Rome, the fact that the Romans loved to forget because they didn't like so much, I think, the Etruscan heritage and so on. So you do have those situations, and I think the Campanian one is actually more interesting in terms of middle ground. In terms of Egypt, you have to look at the very specificities of, on the one hand, the various states participating in Naucratis, and the other hand, the story and the origin and the development of the mercenary camps, and the creation of local identities like the Helleno-Memphitae and so on.
Yeah, I mean, the Greeks in Egypt, obviously, it's quite their interaction with other foreign groups is it's funny because in Herodotus, who is by no means obviously the main or the only source that we have on this, but in Herodotus, he says that the Ionians were the first settlers, like the first foreign settlers in Egypt, which is just quite wrong. But I do wonder in what sense he meant that they were the first settlers. There has to be something more beyond just, Herodotus was Greek, and so that's what he knew. But yeah, I think we have a question from Martin, and then there is one in the chat.
Ah, okay.
Hi, hello.
Yeah, Martin,
Sorry.
if you
If you can hear me. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, hello. Thank you for your talk. This is a methodological question, really. In that, so your comparison of Greeks and Hebrews is obviously made possible because we have the texts, the sources available for it. But when we talk, obviously, for instance, about Greek colonization, the first parallel that people adduce are the Phoenicians. And when thinking about the Phoenicians, we can I first think of the Carthaginians, obviously, and the fact that they were also a society that developed, like, let's say, away from the original homeland, and also, we have echoes of its foundation myths in the Greek and Roman sources, and then, even the name Carthage, the new city, reflects what you were saying about, like, giving a new name marks a new beginning. But of course, the problem with that is that, as far as I'm aware, almost all the texts are lost, for Punic literature, which then means that we can't study them as well. But this makes me think, do you think then that maybe these young societies, as you called them, were actually a lot more common, weren't the exception necessarily, but are just not attested to us due to accidents of survival? And whether you think your avenues of investigation of these societies, the way that you explored in this talk, could, for instance, be used as a framework. I mean, for instance, about the Carthaginians.
About that?
Carthaginians.
Oh, I see. It's a good question. As you say, when we do hear something about Phoenicians, aside from their very many funerary inscriptions, uh, we hear it in such a late period that it smacks of Greek patterns and Greek thinking, like Philo, Biblos, and so on. But one interesting thing is, especially about Carthage, is that the few mentions that we have sound as if, first of all, let's stop saying Phoenicians. It's the city of Tyre, okay? No other city founded Carthage except Tyre, and no other city had oath of fealty, and supposedly the Carthaginians are supposed to participate in the cult of Melkart at Tyre. In fact, when Alexander the Great got there, he found Carthaginian ships around for that purpose. So, in that sense, the ties between Carthage and Tyre, I'm sure it's a revitalization at some point. I don't believe that every single year since whatever century they were coming, but yes, the notion was there, the notion of origin and the notion. That there is such an entity that transcends the specific city, but it transcends it in a very Greek-style metropolis apoikia type of concept, not a Phoenician project as such. We make it that mostly. So, but as you say, we don't know. As for other societies who saw themselves as young, that's a big question, because I sometimes read about societies who don't even have the name for themselves as a people. They just call themselves men or the people, and especially in the Pacific, you've got. On the other hand, in the Pacific, you have also networks of cults and travels and contacts. So it's hard for me to say. Is the ancient Near East an exception to the entire world? Maybe. Well, it is an exception in many other respects to the entire world. Um, Namely, I'm talking about its lack of stories of foundation, migration, arrival from elsewhere, divine sanctions to found a city, and so on and so forth. So a lack is always something difficult to explain. It's easier to perceive when you see it as a contrast with the Hebrew and the Greek types, and then of course the pattern. You shouldn't disregard the next factor, namely, once there's a framework for a story, you change the details, but you keep the framework. And very often the ktisis type of Greek stories keep repeating themselves in various Mediterranean contexts, obviously influenced by the Greek way of telling things. So these are also conventions that we should take into account. As for other societies, I don't know what the Ligurians thought of themselves. I wish I did, and so on.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have another question in the chat, and I think this can be the last question, and then we will let you go. So the question is, to follow up on your point on
Sorry, there's one also on the chat, is there?
Yeah, this one is on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah. So to follow up on your point on the artificiality of picking a founder ancestor to start genealogies, with Greek tradition, we can argue that the motif of the demigod hero partly functions to mask that artificiality. The founder hero is the son of a god and thus a natural starting point in charting the people's descent from the gods. But if this motif sounds like it makes sense so much, that then should need to wonder why the Hebrew tradition doesn't use it. And instead, we have the book of Joshua's bit about leaving the gods of your father beyond the river, which sounds like it's emphasizing, if anything, the lack of ancestral connection between the emerging people and God.
Yes, there is no question of blood relationship between Yahweh and human beings. The story about the sons of God and mortal women precedes the story of the flood in the Old Testament. So none of those guys exist anymore, okay? Because the story of the flood is just a preservation of the story of a single family, the family of Noah. And then everybody is descendant from that line, okay? So there seems to be an effort to erase the very memory of such unions. And again, let's not look for consistency here, okay? Because these are different traditions put together in the text. In fact, the entire book of Genesis is a compilation. Chapter 1 and chapter 2 are in total contradiction to each other. They're telling the same story of creation in two different versions, and they're both there, right next to each other. So I think, yes, I think there's the explicit effort not to even imagine until Christianity that God can have a son. This type of God, I mean. And there's not even a hint for that, even in the adverse literature or in the various warnings of the prophets. Again, as far as I recall. Nobody's claiming that and nobody's charging that. In the Hebrew tradition, that is. So no validation comes through that. Even with the Heracleidae, okay, Heracles was the son of Zeus, problematic son, but the son of Zeus. But until you get to the Heracleidae that are today ruling Sparta, it's a primordial hero already. So that type of connection, if I understood your question correctly, doesn't play a significant role, I think. And I don't think that any of the Homeric heroes, I mean, some of the Homeric heroes are hemitheoi, clearly, they're sons of gods, but none of the historical founders, and we have quite a lot of names for those, is ever associated with that. I mean, okay, Heracleidae are good for founding cities. We know that. Archias from Corinth was the Heraclid. Pentathlos was the Heraclid. Others were that. There was this concept. But again, it's a kind of a stretching the line of genealogy to provide a halo of prestige to the leader. That it in and of itself doesn't constitute the reason, except again in the Spartan world, where Dorieus makes the same Heraclid claim, now reapplying it to Western Sicily in the end of the 6th century. So that does happen. It doesn't happen in the Hebrew tradition, again, as far as I know. Perhaps there are some biblical scholars watching this. They can correct me whenever I'm wrong in this, because there's a vast literature on this, which I know too little. I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for that.